On February 12, 1949, a man in his 30s named Leonardo Paez paced around a radio station in a city called Quito, which is the capital city of Ecuador. It was a Saturday night, and Leonardo and all the people around him were working very hard to get ready for an urgent broadcast. So Leonardo was the director of Radio Quito, which was a highly respected news station owned by a popular newspaper called El Comercio. Most people in Ecuador basically got all their news either from this news station or that newspaper, or both. And running a radio station with such a great reputation was really a source of pride for Leonardo, who had grown up in Quito. So he took his job very seriously, which was why tonight was such a big deal for him. He was about to deliver a potentially life-changing broadcast to the entire city. And just thinking about the gravity of this moment was making him feel sick and sweaty. In the room with Leonardo was a team of producers and sound technicians, as well as one of the station's top news anchors. Most of the last-minute work they were all doing involved organizing stacks of paper that contained instructions about what to say and what to do during this pivotal broadcast. That's what the anchor was double-checking right now. He was the one who had written the broadcast script, and he would be the one actually reading it on the air. Leonardo looked anxiously over at the clock on the wall. It was already a few minutes after 9 p.m., and they didn't have a lot of time left. But even though Leonardo desperately wanted to get this broadcast started as soon as possible, he knew he had to give his anchor the space and time to make sure they were 100% ready before they actually went on the air, because they really only had one chance to do this right. So instead of telling the anchor to come on, hurry it up, Leonardo instead bit his lip and just paced around the station, trying to distract himself by listening to the program that was currently being broadcast over the radio station's airwaves. It was a live musical performance from a duo of singers named Benitez and Valencia. These two combined were really famous, sort of like the Taylor Swift of 1940s Ecuador. And so when people in Quito knew these particular singers were performing on the radio, basically everybody stopped what they were doing and tuned in to listen. So in Quito in the 1940s, nobody had TV, and so radios were like the ultimate form of not just how to get your news, but also of entertainment. It's really where everybody turned. But radios were also very expensive and were sort of a luxury item, so not everybody had one. The people who did have radios would often bring theirs outside to the street so that other people could also hear the programs and the music. And Leonardo knew that all of this meant that at this very moment, all across the city, most of Quito's 250,000 residents were gathered around a radio. And he needed to get his broadcast on the air while he still had everybody's attention. He turned and saw the anchor finally lean back in his chair, indicating he was ready, and so Leonardo knew it was time to go live. Leonardo turned and nodded to his technicians, who were all sitting at a table covered in broadcasting equipment, and one of them, after seeing Leonardo's cue, leaned forward to adjust several knobs and then hit a button on the control panel. And the instant he did this, the voices of the singing duo cut off, and a large red sign that said "On Air" lit up on the wall right above the table. Basically, they were going to cut off the performance to do this broadcast and catch everybody in Quito off guard. And then the anchor leaned into their microphone and, in a very urgent voice, said that they were interrupting this musical program because there was an alarming event happening that everybody in Quito had to hear about. Then he explained the reason for this broadcast. Ecuador was being invaded. About half a mile away from the radio station, 17-year-old Jose Antonio stood outside a restaurant with some of his friends. Jose and his friends and all the diners, plus a bunch of people out on the sidewalk, had been gathered around the restaurant owner's radio, listening to Benitez and Valencia sing, when suddenly the music had cut out and the anchor had come on to say that their country was under attack. And so as Jose and this group is sort of caught off guard and listening to this sudden announcement, the announcer got really emphatic and said, "Listen, the city of Latacunga has been destroyed." And at that, Jose's mouth fell open and he felt this jolt of fear in his chest. Latacunga was only about 60 miles south of Quito. So Jose, along with everybody else around him, instinctively leaned into the radio so they could hear more about what was happening and why. But when they all did that, the broadcast suddenly stopped just as abruptly as it had come on, and the music program came back on. But the street got really quiet as Jose and the crowd just kind of stood there, waiting for something to happen. I mean, really, nobody knew how to react to this. A few people began looking up at the sky, thinking maybe warplanes might be flying overhead, and actually Jose began doing that too, wondering if, that's the next step. But there were no planes, and there were no signs of, anything that would indicate that war was happening nearby, or, whatever destroyed Latacunga was approaching Quito. All Jose could hear was the echo of other radios around the city, now back to playing this musical program. But as the seconds ticked by and the crowd gradually began talking again and kind of going back to normal, some people began making jokes and suggesting that this broadcast was literally a joke, that was meant to be a prank. Others just kind of brushed the whole thing off and just went about their evening as if it had never even happened. However, Jose did notice that some of the people at the tables outside the restaurant where he was were still just kind of staring at the radio and shifting around like they were restless or uncomfortable, like clearly that broadcast had struck a nerve. Jose also kept fidgeting around and trading worried looks with his friends and the other people around him because he wasn't so sure this was a joke. And the reason he wasn't sure was because a sudden invasion of their country had actually happened before. 7 years earlier, in 1941, when Jose was just a kid, the much larger country of Peru had invaded Ecuador after an argument over land along a shared border. Instead of settling the argument diplomatically, the Peruvian army stormed into the disputed territory in Ecuador and conquered it pretty easily. And the fighting had only lasted for maybe about a month before Ecuador accepted that they had lost and retreated, giving up the land. But even though the fighting back then had never actually reached Quito, it had been a terrifying experience for residents of Quito because it made them realize they were not able to defend themselves against a foreign invader. But just then, as Jose and the others are sitting outside the restaurant kind of grappling with what could be going on here, how real is this, is this a prank? Just then, the music that had come back on again on the radio cut out, and once again, the broadcaster's voice came on, and they said they had an update. The enemy had landed their aircraft right on the outskirts of Quito in a northern area called Cotocollao, which was only 8 miles from the center of Quito. And suddenly Jose and the others realized that if the enemy had destroyed Latacunga in the south and now landed in Cotocollao in the north, then the city of Quito was effectively surrounded. But before Jose could even process this thought, another man's voice came on the radio. And unlike the first voice, which was emphatic but, basically calm, this guy was absolutely panicked. He said he was the chief of Quito's newspaper, and then he basically screamed, "The airbase has been taken over by the enemy and destroyed. They're exterminating everything and everyone." He continued to yell that the enemy was using poisonous gas and they were using fire and they were literally killing people and destroying homes and buildings. And then he issued a simple and terrifying warning. They're coming. Jose felt himself let out this yelp that he couldn't even control. He was so suddenly terrified. But he didn't even hear it because all around him, everybody else seemed to react basically the same way all at once. And the streets erupted in screaming and praying and just absolute chaos. Some people began pointing up to the sky, yelling that they could see the enemy. More and more people suddenly began flooding out onto the streets, crowding around the radios, trying to hear more information. They're all terrified and they don't know what's going on. Jose wanted to begin to tell these new people who were coming outside sort of what he and others had heard so far, but everybody out on the street was sort of talking over each other. It was just complete madness. And then literally on the radio, there's all these different voices coming over because clearly the news station is panicked and they can't even get a cohesive message out over this broadcast. However, despite this madness, the one word that kept coming through on the radio that everybody heard was "Go hide. Hide from the enemy. Hide." And Jose and some other people around him were thinking about doing just that when finally a new voice took over the broadcast. And this man was louder and more authoritative than the others, and it sort of immediately projected calm, not just clearly calm on the other end on the broadcast side, but it sort of quelled the crowd for a second. This person sounded like an authority figure, and this person introduced himself as the mayor of Quito. And he said that yes, there are cities around Quito that are currently under attack, but he said he had clear direction that he wanted everybody in Quito to follow. But despite this instruction really being the first kind of clear next steps for people to follow, It didn't make Jose feel any better about this, because the mayor told the people of Quito that the women and children, they had to flee, go hide, go away, go find somewhere safe. But the men had to stay and fight. Jose felt this rush of adrenaline because he's thinking, am I old enough to be considered, one of the men? Will I be expected to fight, or are they going to tell me to go flee with the women and kids? Like, he didn't really know. But he had this calming thought. He's like, you know what? We're at war, and I am going to fight. So he signaled to his friends, sort of saying, all right, let's go, let's get ready here. And the group came together and they left the restaurant. And at that exact same second, a car came flying past on the street, narrowly missing Jose and his friends. And Jose saw it screech around the corner and out of sight before he heard this loud bang and the crunch of metal against stone. Immediately, some men ran after this car because clearly it had gotten into an accident and they need to go if they need help. But other people started running in the opposite direction. And so for Jose and his friends, it's like, what do? Do we go help with the car crash, or do we go, head to the front lines or something? At the same time, women were running by, clutching children, and Jose saw a pregnant woman stumble on past, grimacing as she held her stomach. Screams were echoing from all around him, along with the rapid pounding of boots on cobblestones as people basically ran in every direction. Jose was still trying to figure out which way he should go and what he and his friends should actually do here when he heard a news speaker's voice come on the radio, who announced himself as the Minister of Government, which was basically like the person who controls the security of the entire country of Ecuador. And the Minister of Government said to forget about what the mayor had told them about fighting the enemy, because Ecuador's weapons were literally not powerful enough. There was nothing that anyone in Ecuador could do. This is what the minister said. He basically said, we're going to lose. Just then, another new voice came on the radio. It was this very fast-talking man who said he was actually reporting live on the ground in Quito. Then he screamed out over the broadcast for everyone to run. And then his feed abruptly cut out. And then the original announcer came back on, and his voice shook as he said that reporter who had just said for everybody to run had just been killed. It was 9:21 p.m. 21 minutes had elapsed since this broadcast first went over the air, announcing this invasion of Ecuador. And in that time, it was like the country had spiraled into absolute madness. Now, remember, at this point, Jose is gathered with his friends. He's sort of begun to leave the restaurant, but so many things have happened all around him that he and his friends are just kind of standing there near the restaurant, not really sure what to do. And as they're standing there, Jose noticed that all these people who previously had just remained seated or remained near radios, it was like everybody all at once just got up and began running in different directions, running to the churches, running to their homes. It was like the entire country truly was just in full-blown panic mode. Jose also began to notice families come running out of their homes, dragging suitcases and belongings with them, getting ready to, evacuate hopefully, but where could they even go? They're surrounded. And just then, Jose heard the sound of glass shattering, and he saw a few people over at the restaurant's bar taking liquor from the shelves and pouring themselves drinks before tossing the bottles on the floor. Jose looked and realized his friends had already left him, so he's just standing here all alone. And he knew by this point he can't just keep standing here thinking about what he's going to do. He needs to do something. He needs to act. But just then, the radio crackled back to life, and once again there was a voice calling out one final update. But it was so crazy all around him, Jose couldn't understand what this final update actually was. He just didn't hear it. However, Jose could clearly see other people around him had heard this final update, and they were obviously reacting to it because they stopped. Everybody stopped running around. They put down their suitcases, and everyone just kind of stood there. And then people began going for their guns and knives and torches. And then, once this huge, now armed crowd came together, they began to move as one, all in the direction of the city center. In the city center, in the Radio Quito station, Leonardo watched as the anchor delivered that final update, the one that Jose had not heard but others had and clearly reacted to. A minute later, Leonardo heard glass shattering somewhere one floor below him, along with a loud crackling sound. Then he smelled smoke, and he noticed the air in front of him inside the studio was getting hazy. And then from outside the building, he heard somebody yelling, "Fire!" Behind Leonardo, the anchor grabbed the microphone and pleaded on air to anybody who was listening that the radio station was in trouble and to please come help. But there really was no one left to help them. They were on their own. And when Leonardo and his team realized this, they knew they had to get out of this station by themselves. And so they ran together down the stairs to the exit. But before they even got to the bottom of the steps, the smoke from the fire became so thick they couldn't even breathe. Leonardo realized that the whole first floor must be engulfed in flames. And so the only way out was actually to go up, not down. So Leonardo led the group back up the way they came, running back through the second floor office building, the studio space, where they had recorded the broadcast, and headed up the stairs to the very top floor. And by the time Leonardo got to the top floor, he could hear screams coming from somewhere below him, and they sounded painful and horrible. He hoped his coworkers had been able to follow him up here, but by this point there was so much smoke in the building, he really couldn't see, so he didn't know who was here with him and who had been left behind. And also the roar of the fire was getting louder by the minute, and it was so hot that sweat poured from Leonardo's face and it stung his eyes. And so Leonardo instinctively ran away from the smoke towards the windows. And because they're on the top floor, 3 floors up, looking out, he had a good view of the ground below. And he saw these huge crowds of people on the street. Most of them were holding torches and seemed to be running around in random patterns while big military tanks rolled in behind them, along with this hazy mist from some kind of gas kind of flowing across the entire crowd. Just then, Leonardo felt the floor under his feet begin to shake, and he frantically began to think, how am I going to get out of here? I need to escape. And that's when he saw the roof next door. So the radio station sat next door to a school, which was at this point not yet on fire. Now, the school building was not connected to the radio station, but it was close enough that Leonardo realized that he might be able to open up a window that he's standing right near, get a running start, and literally jump out the window and land on the school roof. Now, obviously, if he undershot this jump, he would fall to the street below and die, but the alternative was stay here and be burned alive. So Leonardo just opened up the window, he backed up, took a deep breath, got a running start, and jumped out the window. He flew into the air, arms flailing as he willed himself to land on the school roof, and after a millisecond in the air, he comes crashing down, slams onto the school building. He had made it. It was painful, but he had escaped. But Leonardo didn't have time to waste here, nor did he really have time to wait to see if others would also make this jump. He really felt like he's sort of on his own here. And so up he got, and despite the pain from impacting the roof, he was basically okay. And he walked across the school building until he went to the next roof. Basically, the next building butted up against the school building. So he climbs onto that roof, and he walks across that roof until he reaches the next building. Again, these buildings are all connected, so there's no more jumping from, one building to the next, but he is going roof to roof, basically high up above the streets of Quito. And down below, he sees, all this madness with the tanks and all these people with torches. He doesn't really know what's going on here. And eventually, he reaches a roof, as he makes his way, that a family was sitting on. And the family, they were looking out at the city, where the sky was still glowing from the light of the fire Leonardo had just escaped from. And when they saw Leonardo, they told him they had actually been down on the streets in that crowd. But when it became too dangerous, they had come up here to escape. And they asked Leonardo, had he done the same thing? Is that why he was here? Leonardo said no. And then he told them who he was and how he actually arrived here and why, and then he asked them for help. And for a second, the family just stared at him in shock. But then they began to talk to each other, and from what Leonardo could hear, and also based on facial expressions, the family seemed mad. But finally, the father looked at Leonardo and said yes, they would help him. However, there was a condition. He told Leonardo that under no circumstances could he, Leonardo, go down on the street with that crowd. The father said Leonardo would have to hide out in this family's house because, the father explained, that everybody in the city, including all those people down there, wanted Leonardo's head. It would turn out Leonardo's broadcast had actually been wildly successful. It had done exactly what he hoped it would do. It grabbed the attention of basically everybody in Quito. The whole city stopped in its tracks to listen to what the broadcast had to say. However, there was one very important fact that Leonardo had decided not to mention in this broadcast until the very end, when in many ways it was already too late. This fact was the final update, the one Jose had not been able to hear, but that had caused everybody on the street who had heard it to stop running around, stop screaming, and just get their guns, knives, and torches and head towards the center of town. The fact that was held off until the very end was this whole broadcast was a farce. The invasion was not real. It was an act, a prank, a joke. The broadcast was like this play. It was an adaptation of a fiction novel called War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, which is about an alien invasion. And so what Leonardo did is he orchestrated this broadcast to sound and feel like a real breaking news broadcast about an alien invasion. The exact same thing had actually been done in the United States a few years earlier in 1938. But in the American version, the listeners had been warned at the beginning of the broadcast that it was not real, and it still caused mass panic, even though they had been warned. And so, during Leonardo's broadcast, when he finally revealed the truth at the very end, the listeners were not, soothed. They were not like, oh boy, what a great prank. They were furious. So furious, in fact, that they went to the radio station in the city center where Leonardo and his broadcast crew were, and they lit it on fire. And so between the radio station fire and also between all the people who took their own lives preemptively, believing aliens were going to be here any minute to kill them, torture them, abduct them, the death toll from this night, from this farce, was between 6 and 20 people. And a whole lot more people were also injured in the chaos. As for 17-year-old Jose Antonio, he would survive, and later in life, he would actually give a tell-all interview about his experience during the so-called alien invasion. As for Leonardo, he didn't face any criminal charges, no jail time, nothing. But this whole incident really destroyed his credibility, and it made people not trust him in Ecuador. So it was basically impossible to get work. And so eventually he had to move to Venezuela. And then as for Radio Quito, the at one point very influential, very important news broadcast, they wouldn't make another broadcast for 2 whole years after this incident. The next story is called Reaching the Other Side. On the evening of Sunday, January 26, 1851, a 23-year-old man named Bailey Staples hurried up the walkway of a home in Fall River, Massachusetts. It was so cold that Bailey's could see his breath, but despite the weather, he could not stop smiling. And that was because he was about to do something that he loved to do that made him a lot of money, and it was actually the 3rd time that day that he was even doing it. I mean, this was awesome. Bailey's was a psychic medium, and he was about to perform a seance. So at this point in America, in 1851, there was this phenomenon going on called the spiritualist movement. Basically, huge numbers of people began to believe that the living and the dead could actually communicate with each other through mediums like Bailey's. And at this time, there was a very specific way that mediums like Bailey's conducted their seances. They would sit at a round table along with all their guests that were going to participate, and they would summon spirits. And what would happen is the participants in these seances could literally tell when it was that the spirit actually made contact with the medium. Because the round table they were all sitting at would shake or move, sometimes the table would thump so violently that one of the legs of the table would break off. And a broken table at a seance was considered a huge success. So seances were a craze all over the country, and many people did genuinely believe that, people like Bailey's, mediums, could talk to ghosts in these seances. But there were lots of people also who didn't believe any of it, thought it was completely made up, but they would still hire people like Bailey's to have these seances at parties and other functions as sort of a form of entertainment, kind of like how you might hire a band or a magician. And in Fall River, Massachusetts, there really was a big appetite for these seances, both, because people believed they were true and lots of people who thought they were fake. And it's in part because there were lots of homes in Fall River, Massachusetts at the time that sort of had some history about being haunted, and so there was sort of groundwork laid for both believers and non-believers to contract people like Bailey's. Now, to be clear, Bailey's whole seance act was a blatant fake. In fact, many of the people who hired Bailey's knew in advance that it was all an act, that Bailey's really was more of a performer than a psychic medium. But Bailey's was really good at faking it, and so he had become kind of like the go-to medium, certainly in Fall River, which meant for him to maintain this flow of business, he really had to put full energy into every performance to keep getting people to call on him. So on this day, as Bailey's is sitting there getting ready to start his third seance of the day, he was tired. I mean, it's pretty exhausting to do these performances, but he knew he just had to get that second wind and just push through and do as good of a job as he possibly could. And so as the homeowner of this third seance opened up the door and let him inside, Bailey's was sure this was going to be at least as good, if not better, than the other performances of the day. Moments later, the homeowner, John Gardner, led Bailey's into the living room where several other guests were already gathered. Bailey's immediately snapped into character. He swooshed his cape as he walked in, and he waved his hand around the room to command their attention. And when everyone turned to look at him, he said, "I have broken 2 tables today, and now I've come to break yours." The guests all cheered and clapped, and Bailey's could tell they were going to be a very enthusiastic audience, which always made these seances much more fun. So into the parlor they all went, and they all took a seat around this big circular table in the middle of the room. And then Bailey's dimmed the lights and walked around the table giving his instructions. He then told them to all hover their hands over the table with their palms down and their fingers spread, and that each of them would have to touch the hands of the person sitting next to them. He told them that once they were all touching, it would create a circuit that was more inviting to the spirits. And so once all of his guests got into position with their hands, Bailey's took his seat and did the same thing with his own hands, creating a full circuit all the way around the table. And at that point, everybody was ready. And so he nodded, and in a commanding voice, he said that now he was going to speak to the spirits. And if the spirits in the room felt like answering, they would move this table. The room got deadly quiet as everyone waited to see what Bailey's would do. But Bailey's just let the tension grow, because he knew that the longer he waited, the more anticipation would build. This was actually Bailey's favorite part of the performance, and he could feel his own heart begin to race. I mean, this really was exciting. But then finally, he broke the silence and called out to the spirits in the room and demanded that if there were a ghost here, to make itself known. And at this, everyone immediately began to look around excitedly, which created the quick distraction that Bailey's actually needed to perform his first trick. So mediums used a few different tools to help them fake communication from these ghosts, and one of those tools were these special hooks that they actually attached to their wrists, and they hid them under their sleeves. And then when they put their hands palm down, hovering over the table like they told everybody else to do, those hooks would actually go below the table and grip on, so the medium could, without looking like they're actually touching the table, literally lift the table up and rattle it around, again, without appearing to actually touch it. Now, it actually took a lot of strength to do this. I mean, imagine moving a huge table around, just like with your arms kind of hovering over the table. But Bailey's was getting really good at it. And so as his guests were all looking around, looking out for ghosts, Bailey's masterfully hooked his hooks right under the table and began moving his wrists around, which caused the table to thump. And as soon as this happened, a woman on the other side of the table screamed, and the other guests began laughing and getting really excited. But Bailey's was only just getting started. He called out to the spirit again, much more forcefully this time, and as he did, he literally made the table rise off the floor as all the guests gasped. One man asked how Bailey's was even doing this. I mean, he knew this was fake, but how are you lifting the table up? Because his hands are over the table, remember. It's just these secret hooks underneath. But Bailey's just kind of ignored the man and smiled. And then he said to the spirit that if you're willing to communicate with us, rap on this table one time. And then Bailey's used the hook, underneath the table to make a knocking sound. And as he did this, the woman who had first screamed on the other side of the table, she jumped. She was so scared. And it actually caused Bailey's to have this surge of adrenaline, like he was really doing a good job. And so Bailey's actually kind of leaned into this and rattled the table a bit more for dramatic effect. And in doing this, Bailey's was really exerting himself. He's trying not to give off the vibe that he's moving this table around, but he really is. And so he's sweating bullets. And he's also yelling out to the spirit, demanding them to come forward and talk to us. But then, as Bailey's is doing this big act here that he in no way suspects is going to actually call spirits into the room, he suddenly felt the room turn icy cold. And he had this weird tingling sensation flowing through him. He blinked and then his vision got hazy. This had never happened to him during any of his seances. And clearly it was having an effect on him because he no longer was trying to communicate with the dead. He was just kind of standing there, very uneasy, like the seance was actually doing something, that there really might be spirits in the room. Now, Bailey's can tell he's getting stared at, and he doesn't want to destroy his business here, like he needs to maintain the act. He can't just spook himself out and stop the seance. But at the same time, he couldn't break out of this weird feeling he had. The room felt so cold. I mean, something was off here. And then he tried to move, and it was like he couldn't. He was frozen. Now, at the same time Bailey's is experiencing this, across the table, the homeowner and host, John Gardner, is just sitting there staring at Bailey's, trying to figure out what's actually happening here. And from his perspective, he watched as Bailey's went from sort of standing there awkwardly, unable to move, it looked like, to then sitting down in his chair and sort of lurching back in this awkward position. And then Bailey's eyes began darting all over the room, and also his breathing got really ragged and heavy. And John couldn't help but feel like it looks like Bailey's is possessed for real. And then Bailey's began to speak, and his voice sort of cracked as he did, and he began mumbling something that John and the others couldn't understand. I mean, John, he really couldn't help it. He felt sort of spooked by this. I mean, this was really convincing. John actually wanted to applaud. I mean, Bailey's acting was so good here. But he also didn't want to destroy the act and sort of break his character. You know, like Bailey's, John and most of his guests did not believe seances were real at all. But, I mean, Bailey's performance was really turning out to be way better than any of them had expected. But just then, Bailey's shot up out of his chair, and the whole table thumped again and shook, and then Bailey's let out this almost ghostly-sounding moan, and then one of John's guests asked if the ghost was speaking through Bailey's. But instead of answering, Bailey's eyes rolled all the way back in his head, so only the whites were visible. John and the others were transfixed. I mean, this was just incredible, really kind of scary stuff here. But then Bailey's let out another moan and then fell backwards hard onto the ground. And for a second, there was just confused silence. Because if this is an act, I mean, that was a violent fall. This looks really legitimate. How is Bailey's able to do this over and over again? This seems real. And it was in that moment of realizing that something is off here that some of the guests began to scream and they began to run out of the room. A few minutes later, a local physician named Dr. Hopper ran into the parlor of John Gardner's home. He'd been summoned by one of the guests who had panicked and actually ran out and gotten him. But that guest had been rambling about a ghost and a possession, so Dr. Hopper really wasn't sure what kind of problem he was actually responding to. But now he could see there was a group of people dressed for a party gathered around what appeared to be a seance table, pointing to the floor, where there was this young man lying in a crumpled heap. Dr. Harper went to the young man and reached out and felt the man's neck, but there was no pulse. And so the doctor turned and looked at the group and said, "He's dead." And before the group could really even react, the doctor said, "Now hold on, someone needs to slowly and clearly explain what happened here." John Gardner stepped forward and now in a very shaking voice explained that this young man was a medium whose name was Bailey Staples, and he had been doing a seance, and he had demanded a ghost talk to the group. And then a moment later, he was thrashing around, apparently possessed by this ghost, and then he fell to the ground, dead. John said they had all thought this seance was a fake. I mean, when they hired Bailey's, they literally thought this was just going to be a performance, nothing real. But now, I mean, they didn't know what to think. This looked very real. Dr. Hopper shook his head, not really sure what to make of this explanation. He certainly did not believe in ghosts, but after a quick examination of Bailey's, he really couldn't see any obvious cause for the medium's death. So Dr. Hopper got to his feet and told the dinner guests that, whatever killed Bailey Staples was not a ghost, but he didn't know what it was yet. However, he would get to the bottom of it. However, by the next morning, news of Bailey's death had spread all over Fall River and beyond, and it made the immediate autopsy that Dr. Hopper wanted to do to figure out what happened to him basically impossible. Now, the reason it was impossible is because some people were claiming that this was a ghost that possessed Bayles, but it didn't actually kill him. The ghost must have put Bayles into a trance where he appears dead, but is not actually dead. But if Dr. Hopper performs the autopsy on him, the autopsy will kill Bayles, so you can't do that. And so pretty quickly, you have all these people that are showing up at Dr. Hopper's clinic and the local police station demanding authorities give them Bayles' body to prevent the doctor from killing him by doing an autopsy on him. And so it's this whole scene. And at the same time, keep in mind, the country as a whole has been taken with seances. That was already something that was sort of happening everywhere. But this story, which sort of legitimized the idea that ghosts could be real and ghosts can also be dangerous given what happened to Bayles, this story is spreading like wildfire all over the country. And so at a time where people in America were already big on seances, this pretty much dumped gasoline on that, and seances became even more popular, but now because they felt real, not because they were entertainment. On January 28th, so 2 days after Bayles was pronounced dead, Dr. Hopper stood in the basement of the local morgue holding a scalpel. He had finally gotten the approval to go ahead and conduct his autopsy, but he knew that a lot of people were not happy about it. And now he was looking down at Bayles' body, realizing that, to his own surprise, he was sort of nervous about this. Like the idea that, what if this guy's actually still alive and I'm about to kill him with this autopsy? Now, logically, the doctor did not think Bayles was in a trance, but it was unsettling how physically healthy Bayles' body looked. He was young and strong with no history of illness, and there wasn't a mark on his body anywhere to explain why he was dead. The only blemishes on his skin were these slight bruises around his wrists, which Dr. Hopper understood were from the special hooks he had been wearing when he died to lift up the table. But Dr. Hopper shook off the nerves and moved his scalpel towards the skin of Bayles' chest and made his first incision, opening up the chest cavity. And that was when Dr. Hopper saw it. It would turn out, on the day Bayles Staples died, he was at his absolute performative peak as he lifted John Gardner's table up off the ground and made the seance guests scream and laugh. But what Bayles didn't know, and what Dr. Hopper found when he performed the autopsy, was that Bayles had a pre-existing heart condition, and his passionate performance, coupled with the physical exertion it took to lift up that heavy parlor table with just his wrists, and the fact that Bayles had also already given 2 other similar performances that day, caused his weak heart to swell and develop an aneurysm, which ruptured and caused fatal internal bleeding. Bayles Staples had basically put on the absolute best seance performance of his life. It was so good, in fact, that it killed him, and also accidentally convinced an entire house full of dinner guests and many people all across the country that ghosts were real. In the summer of 1982, a corporate sales director named Roger Donovan walked up the steps of a suburban house in Detroit, Michigan, and knocked on the door. It was his 29th birthday, and one of his coworkers had insisted on throwing him a party. When the door swung open, nearly half his office was clustered inside, and they all shouted happy birthday and blew noisemakers. Roger had only been at the job for about a year, so he really appreciated the warm welcome, especially since lately he'd been feeling strange and kind of lousy. He developed a nasty wet cough, despite not being congested or sick. Some nights it got so bad he couldn't get to sleep, which left him feeling wrecked in the morning. He hoped it was just some weird seasonal allergy thing, and so he was just trying to tough it out. So for now, this party was a pleasant distraction. Roger had some drinks and snacks and caught up with a few coworkers he rarely got a chance to chat with. But towards the end, he found himself in the back patio near a group of people who were smoking. Although Roger himself had never been a smoker, being around smokers didn't usually bother him. But tonight, the smoke triggered his cough, and once it started, Roger couldn't stop. It got so intense that he felt embarrassed and decided to leave. But on the drive home, the cough stirred up this churning in his stomach. He could feel liquids sloshing around inside of him, and it made him feel queasy. Roger thought back to what he had eaten at the party, but there was nothing out of the ordinary, except for maybe a slice of birthday cake, which he didn't eat very often. And so he couldn't figure out why he was having so much gastric distress. Back at his house, where Roger lived alone, he turned on the TV and laid on the couch. He hoped being sedentary would help calm his stomach down. But only minutes after laying down, Roger began coughing heavily again and then felt the surge of nausea that immediately forced him to sit up straight. And as he was sitting there, he began sipping some water, and eventually he sort of calmed down and caught his breath, but he still felt rattled by what his body was doing. Crawling into his bed later that night, Roger wondered if maybe he had developed some new allergy to something, or if the coughing indicated a respiratory problem, like bronchitis. Either way, it worried him, because it was new, and because he had no idea what could be causing it. Clutching a pillow to his still churning stomach, he realized it was probably time to see a doctor. A few days later, Roger sat on the examination table in the office of a local pulmonologist, which is a doctor who specializes in the respiratory system. The doctor held a stethoscope to Roger's chest and asked him to take in a few deep breaths. After a minute of doing this, the doctor nodded, removed the stethoscope from his ears, and told Roger that his breathing sounded like he had asthma. Roger was surprised because he'd always lived a very active life and never had any breathing issues before. The doctor shrugged and explained that asthma can start at any age and can range from very mild to severe. He thought Roger most likely had what's called late-onset asthma, which is actually very common in adults. He prescribed Roger an inhaler and told him that using it frequently would make a big difference in his cough and breathing. He also advised Roger to see a gastroenterologist for any of his digestion issues. Roger took his advice and a few days later visited with a recommended local gastroenterologist named Dr. Ostrander. And after listening to Roger's organs and asking some questions about Roger's medical history, Dr. Ostrander concluded that Roger probably had acid reflux. This would explain Roger's nausea, his digestive pain, and his coughing. At first, Roger was skeptical of this diagnosis. He had never had digestion issues before, and he found it especially odd that it would set in at the same time as his late-onset asthma. Why would all of this just start now, out of the blue? Dr. Ostrander wasn't a lung specialist, so he wasn't really sure about if and how the asthma played a role in the acid reflux. But he said it's not usually connected to something like acid reflux. He explained that for most people, acid reflux is not something a person has their whole life. It comes and goes, depending on a variety of factors. Sometimes it's triggered by eating unusually rich foods, or lying down too soon after a big meal, or stress, or smoking cigarettes, or even certain medications can cause it. Dr. Ostrander explained that when food travels down the esophagus to the stomach, sometimes the sphincter muscle at the bottom of the esophagus relaxes at the wrong time, or it relaxes too much. That allows stomach acid to flow back up into the esophagus, which can cause heartburn, nausea, or stomach pain. And if the stomach acid sloshes high enough, it spills into the lungs, and that can block the airway. And so the doctor speculated that this could be the source of Roger's cough. Dr. Ostrander prescribed Roger some medication to help reduce his stomach acid production. But otherwise, he told Roger not to worry too much and just be aware of his diet in case there might be a particular food triggering all of his symptoms. A few months later, on a rainy autumn evening, Roger sat inside on his couch, feeling defeated. He had been using his inhaler diligently for months, but he hadn't noticed a difference. His cough was the same. And the meds had done nothing for his acid reflux. Even on nights when Roger went out of his way to eat an extra bland, simple dinner to avoid irritating his stomach, he'd still feel a surge of nausea as soon as he laid down. The Michigan weather didn't help either. Once summer ended and the temperature started to plummet, the chill of the air would sting Roger's lungs, particularly on early mornings before work. By the time full-on winter hit, Roger knew he'd basically have to stay indoors because outside, he'd struggle to breathe. Being cooped up inside so much only darkened Roger's already dark mood. But he hoped that eventually, somehow, his body would acclimate to whatever was going on, and he'd come out on the other side. In the meantime, he took another puff on his inhaler and laid back down on the couch. About 10 years later, Roger walked alone down a dark and silent suburban street late at night. The only sound was his footsteps echoing on the concrete and the occasional huff of his inhaler. Walks like these had become routine for Roger. Over the past decade, his cough and digestion problems had steadily worsened. Roger relocated to Augusta, Georgia for a new job last year, but that hadn't helped. It was a welcome change from breathing the frigid air of Midwestern winters, but even in the warmer southern climate, he often woke up with liquid in his lungs, causing him to cough until he vomited. These fits left him feeling delirious and nauseous, so he began taking late-night walks around the neighborhood just to settle his stomach. As Roger slowly shuffled along the empty streets, he felt depressed and disoriented. He'd recently turned 40, which he worried might be a health tipping point. What if his stomach issues and coughing only got worse with age? Roger took another puff on his inhaler and sighed. He didn't understand why all the doctors he had visited over the years had accomplished so little. At this point, Roger had been taking acid reflux medication and using his inhaler for a decade straight, yet his symptoms really had not improved in the slightest. And the lack of sleep as a result of these symptoms that were just not being curbed was really taking a toll on him and beginning to affect his performance at work. As Roger looped back towards home, letting his thoughts wander, he suddenly noticed an odd sensation in his chest, an unfamiliar pressure he'd never felt before. He stopped under a streetlight and ran a finger over his chest, trying to sense where this pressure was located. Roger took a slow, deep breath and abruptly stopped. There it was again. The moment air filled his lungs, he could sense it. There was this soft pressure at the base of his lungs. It was almost like there was an invisible hand inside of his abdomen, literally holding his lungs up. Roger shook his head, totally confused. I mean, who could actually feel their lungs? That's not a sensation you get. And so now, in addition to all these terrible symptoms he had had for years, Roger wondered if he was also starting to lose his mind. Another decade later, on a cold morning in the fall of 2003, Roger sat at the edge of an indoor swimming pool in suburban Rhode Island. His brain still felt blurry from yet another bad night's sleep, but he hoped a good swim would set him straight. After 8 years in Georgia and countless doctor's visits that led nowhere, Roger decided he needed a major change. He was approaching 50 years old and felt like he was in a bit of a rut, so he applied for and landed a job near Providence, Rhode Island as the vice president of a technology company. Roger was coming up on 3 years at this new job and had grown to love the team there. But unfortunately, his health problems had come with him. His cough had steadily worsened over the years, lasting longer and cutting deeper. The acid in his stomach sloshed around and went up into his esophagus anytime he wasn't actively standing upright. As a result, he had taken to sleeping on a mound of pillows to try to keep his body somewhat propped upright. It was not comfortable, but otherwise he'd be woken up by a sudden surge of vomit. In an effort to strengthen his breathing, Roger had found a local health club with an indoor pool and started swimming most mornings before work. It was the only activity Roger had discovered where his body could be horizontal and not trigger his symptoms. He didn't understand why, but he embraced it. Swimming had become, by far, the best part of his day. Once he was ready, Roger took a deep breath, dove into the water, and swam all the way to the other side. After a couple of warm-up laps, he tried testing how far he could swim while holding his breath underwater, surprising himself by making it 2 whole lengths of the pool. As he climbed out and toweled off, Roger felt energized. He also felt confident that whatever his health issues were, he did not have asthma. There is no way he'd be able to hold his breath so long and swim so vigorously if he did. It would also explain why the inhaler had never made a difference in 20 years. Roger was tempted to just throw the inhaler away. A couple weeks later, Roger hosted a barbecue party and suffered the worst flare-up of symptoms he'd ever had in over 20 years. While he was grilling burgers for his coworkers, Roger at some point had casually bent over to plug something in, and a torrent of half-digested food surged out of his mouth. There was so much stomach acid leaving his body that Roger fell to his knees, unable to breathe, and feeling this terrible burning sensation all along his esophagus. The experience was a wake-up call. Roger had to face the truth. His condition was not something he could just keep ignoring. It was only intensifying over time, and his body was starting to lose the fight against it. A week after the barbecue, Roger's colleagues stopped him in the hallways to ask how he was feeling. By now, word had spread. Everyone knew something was seriously wrong with Roger's health. But as much as he tried to act like it was no big deal, privately, Roger was starting to panic. He knew his life could not go on like this forever. He had been battered by the same digestive and respiratory symptoms for decades, and clearly they were not going anywhere. The thought of fighting this battle for decades more to come felt unbearable. But Roger did bear it without relief for 20 more years. And he did that by distracting himself, by focusing on his career. After leaving Rhode Island in 2008, Roger had hopped around to a few different places before finally landing the biggest opportunity of his life in 2014. He was named the chief marketing officer for a fabric manufacturer in Cleveland. On a spring morning in 2023, Roger strolled through the company's massive industrial warehouse to inspect a new delivery of fabrics all neatly stacked on pallets. Although he'd recently turned 70, Roger had no intentions of retiring anytime soon. However, the harsh chemicals used to clean the knitting machinery wreaked havoc on his lungs. Even before COVID hit, Roger had taken to wearing a mask in the warehouse to avoid exposing others to his coughing. Even so, his coughing fits only continued to get worse. Many days, Roger would be forced to make an excuse in order to hurry to his office, lock the door, and hack until he vomited into a trash can. Then he would wait until the entire office emptied out to dispose of the vomit in a toilet. And the nights after work were very lonely, because his condition made it impossible to socialize. Roger's digestive system was too fragile. He dreaded going to bed, knowing that his cough would inevitably wake him in a fit. The lack of sleep continued to add up, and he was older now and really felt his age, and so it wasn't as easy to bounce back in the mornings. Then came the breaking point. Later that week, in the middle of the night, Roger woke with his usual cough and stumbled to the refrigerator to fill a glass of cold water. But he couldn't make it. A sharp pang in his chest made his knees wobble, and he slumped onto the couch. Roger tried to take slow, deep breaths, but his lungs felt shrunken. The shortness of breath made him so dizzy, he worried he was about to pass out. Lying there motionless, waiting for his body to stabilize, it hit Roger with total clarity. It could not go on like this. It was no longer bearable. When his alarm went off later that morning, Roger called his primary care physician and booked the next available appointment. A couple days later, in the middle of the weekly staff meeting, Roger's cell phone vibrated with a voicemail from his doctor. Roger had been on edge, waiting to hear back about the results of a CT scan. At his appointment a few days ago, Roger's doctor had theorized that Roger might have chronic bronchitis. That would explain the wet, nagging cough. He proposed a CT scan to look for inflammation in the tubes connecting the windpipe to the lungs, which Roger agreed to. But the last 48 hours after the scan had dragged by as Roger's head swirled with worries. He hoped whatever news he got would finally put the years of uncertainty to rest. Apologizing for the interruption, Roger stepped into the hallway to return the call. And as soon as he heard his doctor's voice, he could tell something was very serious. The doctor spoke calmly and urged Roger not to worry until they knew more, but his CT scan had come back showing dark spots across his lungs. These could be one of many things, but among the possibilities, unfortunately, was cancer. Roger's heart sank. A part of him had always dreaded that his condition might be something truly terrible. Slipping the phone back into his pocket, Roger returned to the meeting. His coworkers carried on with business as usual, but Roger's mind was elsewhere, reeling at how everything in his life could have led to this. Dr. Gregory Crane had heard plenty of unusual medical histories over his many years as a pulmonologist in Cleveland. But the 70-year-old man sitting in his office was a rare case. Roger's story spanned so many different jobs and cities and major life changes, yet throughout them all, his symptoms had never improved. And then when Roger explained how he could actually feel his lungs, like there was a phantom hand inside of his body, Dr. Crane was riveted. Roger had been referred to Dr. Crane after receiving his CT scan results. Although it took multiple tests to prove it, Roger's doctor eventually determined that those dark spots on his scan were not cancerous. But despite this good news, Dr. Crane could plainly see that Roger was not a healthy man. His eyes were sunken and his skin looked gray from fatigue and the exhaustion of constant coughing. Ruling out cancer was a relief, but it didn't solve the much bigger question of what was causing Roger's condition. Dr. Crane's first thought was that Roger must have some unusual type of asthma. But Roger was quick to explain how previous doctors had diagnosed him similarly, yet 4 decades of using an inhaler had not helped at all. And so after running some additional tests, Dr. Crane told Roger something that no doctor had told him in 40 years. Roger's hunch was right. He definitely was not asthmatic. All those huffs on the inhaler had been for nothing. Roger sighed, shook his head, and then pulled out his inhaler and chucked it at the small trash can in the corner of the room. But he missed, and it hit the floor. When Roger stood up to pick up the inhaler, he suddenly began coughing violently. He quickly stood back upright, and the cough died down. But the sight of Roger bent over gave Dr. Crane an idea. He told Roger there was one more test he wanted to run. One morning the following week, Roger dragged himself out of bed after another ragged, sleepless night. His head felt tingly and hollow from being awoken every couple of hours in a fit of coughing. No matter how simply he streamlined his diet, or what angle he propped himself at to go to bed, his stomach still churned and his lungs still felt blocked. As an increasingly elderly man, Roger worried he would not be able to keep fighting this off much longer. Today, however, he felt more optimistic than usual. He had a special procedure planned with Dr. Crane that he actually had high hopes for. Roger showered, but then skipped coffee and breakfast because he was told not to eat or drink anything for 4 hours before this operation. At the hospital, Roger was led to a room where a technician was preparing a computer monitoring system. Roger felt a bit nervous, but more than that, he felt desperate. His body was beaten down by fatigue. This procedure seemed like his last chance. There was a knock at the door, and Dr. Crane entered, followed by a nurse carrying a kit of medical equipment. Dr. Crane told Roger to lay on the hospital bed and try to relax. Roger did his best, but flinched when Dr. Crane moved close, holding a thin, flexible catheter. Dr. Crane had warned Roger that this procedure would be uncomfortable, but even though Roger knew that, now that it was happening, it was hard not to be anxious. The first thing Dr. Crane did was he sprayed a numbing medication up Roger's nostrils and into the back of his throat. After that, he guided the tube up Roger's nose while the nurse handed Roger a cup of water to drink. With each swallow, Dr. Crane slid the catheter further and further down Roger's esophagus until it reached the entrance of his stomach. Roger almost gagged many times, but managed not to break into a coughing fit. Once the catheter was secure, Dr. Crane looped it over Roger's ear and connected it to a small computer about the size of a smartphone. Then he attached the computer to a belt, which Roger was to wear for the next 24 hours. Roger could eat and drink like normal, but he would need to keep a diary of his meals, activities, and symptoms. Meanwhile, the tip of the catheter inside of Roger would be recording the levels of acid in Roger's esophagus and transmitting them to the computer. The rest of Roger's day was bizarre. Doing anything with a catheter up your nose and down your throat was awkward. He had told his boss he was taking that day off for medical reasons, so he had plenty of time to kill. Roger went for a long walk in a nearby park, then bought some groceries, and made dinner for himself while watching TV. Nighttime felt long, strange, and uncomfortable. Roger's stomach was irritated by the tubing, and his breathing was as bad as ever. Lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling with a bulky belt around his waist strapped to a computer, Roger felt a little ridiculous. But he had run out of options in his life. And so at this point, even the smallest sliver of a chance that this procedure could help him was worth taking. And the next day, he found out it was definitely worth the risk. Dr. Crane had downloaded and studied the data from the computer, and the results were conclusive and shocking. The test that Dr. Crane had administered was called a 24-hour pH impedance test. By tracking the fluctuations in acid levels in Roger's esophagus across an entire day and night, he discovered something that no other doctor in 40 years ever had. Roger's esophagus was defective. He was missing a sphincter at the bottom of it. That meant there was no barrier between his esophagus and stomach like most people have. So there was nothing to stop the contents of his stomach from coming back up if his body was positioned at the wrong angle. And so night after night in bed, Roger's stomach fluids flowed up into his lungs. That's why he coughed so much at night and why walking around upright helped settle his stomach. Dr. Crane could not determine whether Roger was simply born without a sphincter in his esophagus or whether his sphincter had been damaged or destroyed over the years somehow. But regardless, the effect was the same. Roger's rare condition actually had a name. It was called non-erosive reflux disease. Roger was shocked as Dr. Crane explained his findings. All these years, he had imagined so many different outcomes, but this was never one of them. Dr. Crane referred Roger to a gastric surgeon colleague of his named Dr. Amanda Davenport to confirm his findings. But she soon discovered that a missing sphincter was not Roger's only medical curiosity. It would turn out the reason Roger could feel his lungs as if there was a phantom hand putting pressure at the bottom of his lungs was because his stomach had broken through the layer of muscle at the bottom of his lungs, called the diaphragm, and was actually pushed up against them. That meant the fluid in his stomach was directly next to his lungs. That pressure Roger felt came from the stomach fluids sloshing around because there was no sphincter to contain them. And so that was what he was feeling. Dr. Davenport was able to move Roger's stomach down, mend his diaphragm, and create a sphincter in his esophagus by using extra tissue from his stomach lining. And the operation was successful. And ever since, Roger's cough has vanished, and he can now bend and stoop and sleep in any position he wants without worrying. In 1994, 39-year-old Mauro Prosperi took part in the brutal Marathon des Sables, which is a 6-day endurance race covering 155 miles through the Sahara Desert. The competition was known as one of the toughest in the world, but Prosperi was a former Olympic athlete, and he kept himself in unbelievable physical shape. He was also a police officer back in Italy, which kept him even more active, so he felt ready. The competition's desert terrain was so dangerous that participants had to indicate where they wanted their bodies sent if they did not survive the race. In preparation for the race, Prosperi would run 25 miles a day for weeks leading up to it, and he would give himself less and less water as he was running to get accustomed to dehydration. But despite how much he was training and his incredible athletic resume that showed he's someone that can probably do this, his wife was very concerned. But he would tell her, the worst thing that's going to happen to me is I'll get a little sunburned. The race kicked off at its starting point in Morocco on April 10th, and initially it was going very smoothly. Prosperi was always at the front of the pack, and he was always the first Italian to finish that day's stage. And so when he would finish, he would go to his tent and he'd put an Italian flag on the outside to show the other Italians doing the race where they could find him to come inside and chat. And he would say that part of the race was really fun. Then things went wrong on the fourth day during the longest and most difficult phase of the race. When he set out that morning, it was already very windy, and he found himself in this section between these two big sand dunes, and the pace setters had already gone way ahead, so he's totally alone. And then out of nowhere, this massive sandstorm kicks up and completely blinds him. He can't go anywhere because he can't see where he's going, and so he manages to kind of feel his way to this rock, where he gets down behind this rock, and he thinks to himself, I'll just wait it out and then continue on. But the sandstorm raged for 8 hours. And when it was finally done, it was totally dark outside, so Prosperi couldn't see anything. So he decides, you know what, I'm gonna have to sleep on the dunes, and tomorrow morning I'll have to get up and keep going. And his biggest concern at this point was not that he was in a survival situation. It was, man, I was in 4th place in this race, and now with this huge setback, I'm probably gonna finish last. And so when he went to sleep that night, all he was thinking about is, man, I gotta get up and go as fast as I can so I don't finish last tomorrow. But when the sun came up the next morning, Prosperi looked around and he realized he had a much bigger problem. The sandstorm had been so strong, it had completely altered the landscape. The dunes had all moved around. He had no points of reference. And so even though he had a map and he had a compass, he had no way to orient himself, so he had no idea what direction to go. Anybody that competed in this race really needed to be self-sufficient, and so Prosperi had a knife, he had plenty of dehydrated food, he had a sleeping bag, but he had very little water. He had about a half bottle of water, because at each of the checkpoints during the day, the race officials would give you all of this water, and the idea was you would drink it all by the time you got to your next checkpoint. And he had not made it to the next checkpoint, and so was very low on water. As he's looking around, realizing this is a really bad situation, he thinks to himself, other runners must have had this same thing happen to them. They probably had to hunker down yesterday during the sandstorm, and they're just waking up now. They're looking around. I'm bound to find someone, we'll link up and we will get to the end of this race and we'll be just fine. And so he runs to the top of a sand dune and looks around expecting to see someone, and he doesn't. There's no one in all directions. It's just completely barren desert. And so he leaves that sand dune, goes up another one and does the same thing. He's looking around and there's nobody there. And over the course of several hours, he was just running to the peaks of these different sand dunes, expecting to see someone, not seeing anyone, becoming more panicked and expending more energy. And finally, by the late afternoon, when he's sweating profusely and the sun is bearing down on him and he still hasn't seen anyone, he realizes he's gonna die if he keeps doing this, and he needs to be smart about this. And so at this point, he went into survival mode, and he decided that the only times he's gonna move are gonna be at night and in the early morning hours, because those are the times when the sun is not up and it's still pretty cool, and he can conserve energy that way. He also began peeing into bottles and began conserving his urine to drink later when he did run out of water. And so over the next 2 days, he conserved his energy, but he was just kind of drifting through the desert and he wasn't really getting anywhere. He didn't know if he was making progress because he had nothing to go to. He wasn't seeing anyone, and he was starting to realize the situation is getting worse and worse by the minute. And then, in an incredible stroke of luck, he comes across this Muslim shrine in the middle of nowhere that Bedouins would use as they traveled across the desert, and he ran inside hoping that there'd be a person in there. And there was a person in there, but they were dead inside of a coffin. But he was happy that he now had shelter over his head, and this felt like progress. He began taking stock of his new surroundings, and when he was inside the shrine looking up into the ceiling, he saw it was lined with hundreds of bats. And at this point, he's really hungry, he's really thirsty, and so he climbed up into the rafters and began grabbing handfuls of bats and drinking their blood. After drinking the blood of 20 bats, he used some of the wood that was inside of the shrine, and he built a fire outside, and that would be his way to signal planes and helicopters going overhead that he assumed would be out looking for him. And so he sets the fire and he comes back inside expecting, over the next couple of days someone's bound to find him, but nobody does. And 4 days go by, and 3 separate times a plane or a helicopter flew directly over him. He's got his fire going, he's out there flagging him down, but nobody saw him. And so at the end of those 4 days, he's now been out in the desert roaming around for nearly a week, and he's starting to realize that this is the end. He's not going to survive this. No one knows where he is. No one's seen him so far. He's running out of supplies. This is it. And so knowing he was staring down a long, painful death, either by dehydration or starvation, he decided he was going to expedite it. And he would say later that he did not feel sad about this. It just was a logical choice he was making. He figured this way, if he died inside of the shrine was more likely to be found than if he had died somewhere out in the desert where sand would cover him up. And so he said it was more likely people would find the shrine and therefore find him, and so there'd be closure for his family. And so Prosperi took a piece of charcoal from the fire, wrote a message to his wife, and then cut his wrists and laid down, expecting never to wake up again. But the next morning, he woke up, and he had barely bled because his blood was too thick. He literally could not bleed to death. He took this as a sign that he was supposed to live, and he suddenly felt motivated to survive. He decided to leave the shrine and follow the advice that one of the race organizers had given all of them at the start, which was, if you get lost, follow the clouds you can see just beyond the horizon at dawn. There you will find civilization. So Prosperi hopped up and began heading towards what he believed were those clouds. He walked for days in the desert, grabbing snakes and lizards off the ground and eating them raw. He said his inner caveman came out, like his primal desire to live, and he had no problems eating the things he was eating. Prosperi grew so dehydrated he couldn't even urinate anymore. So he began drinking the liquid inside of succulents that grew inside of dried up riverbeds, and he also began sucking out the moisture in his wet wipes that were in his backpack. On the 9th day, Prosperi saw a little shepherd girl off in the distance, and she saw him, and she was scared of him, and she turned and ran away. And at first, Prosperi is devastated because he has no strength to chase after her, but she had actually gone down to her tribe and told them about this strange man wandering the desert, and they came running up over the dunes, and they brought him in, and they gave him food and drink, and they sent someone to get police. After police picked him up and brought him back to their headquarters, he discovered he had walked over 181 miles from where he had gotten lost on the course all the way to Algeria. His family and race organizers had gone out looking for him after he went missing, but all they ever found was his shoelace, and so they assumed he was dead. It would take him 2 years to fully recover from this ordeal, but after he did, he went on to run 8 more desert races. In 2012, 35-year-old Jose Alvarenga was an extremely experienced fisherman, having spent years and years commercially fishing. In November of that year, Jose volunteered to do a 30-hour deep-sea fishing shift for his company off the coast of his hometown in Mexico. He hoped he'd be able to catch some sharks, marlins, and sailfish, three of the more lucrative fish you can catch. Unfortunately, the guy Jose usually went deep-sea fishing with was not able to go at the last minute, but Jose still really wanted to go out and do this shift, and so he took the only other fisherman in their company that was willing to go or that could go, and it was a 23-year-old, extremely inexperienced, brand new fisherman named Ezequiel Cordoba. And while Jose knew he was not going to be a huge asset out on the seas, he figured, it's a short trip and we're not that far off from shore, so you know what, he's fine, I'll take him. On November 17th, the pair set out on their 24-foot fiberglass skiff with a small motor. On board were various fishing tools, a radio, and a large icebox to hold all the fish they were going to catch. Once they reached the area they were going to be fishing, their trip immediately started paying off, and within just a couple of hours, they had already almost completely overloaded the icebox. Their luck was so good that when they saw a storm coming in, they decided to wait and continue to catch as many fish as they possibly could before heading in at the very last minute. But the storm that was rolling in was like the storm of the century, and by the time they did turn around to head into shore, it was too late. They got caught up in this wicked storm where the rain was so intense they literally could not see to shore. They tried to use their compass and other instruments to navigate to shore, but between the winds and the waves and the fact that their boat was so heavy from the nearly 1,000 pounds of fish they had caught, they were just really unable to get anywhere near shore. When the storm just continued to rage and they were just kind of floundering in the water, they decided they needed to dump their catch. So they dumped all 1,000 plus pounds of fish back into the water. But even then, with a more agile boat, the storm was so severe they just could not navigate effectively. And so Jose turned off the engine and told Ezequiel that their best chance here was to just wait it out. And once it was done, they would head back into shore. But that storm continued to rage for 5 days. The torrential rain never stopped. The waves were huge. The winds were awful. And before long, they were getting pulled out to sea and had no idea where they were. Now, they had only planned to be out for 30 hours, so they did not have much in the way of supplies. And so after a few days, they had run out of food and they had run out of water. But luckily, because it was raining so much, they were able to drink the rainwater. But the real immediate problem they were facing is over the course of those 5 days, the storm was just battering their boat. And by the time the storm cleared, their boat was ruined. Their motor had been torn off and was just gone. Their electronics were busted and all of their fishing gear was either damaged or gone. There was enough charge in the radio for Jose to call back to his boss on the mainland and send a mayday message, but the radio died before they got a return message, so they weren't able to confirm if anybody on land was going to come looking for them. Left with minimal supplies, no radio, no motor, Jose and Ezequiel just had to hope somebody on the mainland heard their message, and they slowly began to adjust to life at sea. Jose was able to leap into the water and catch turtles, fish, seabirds, and jellyfish with his bare hands, and so that's what they ate. And then the two of them would try to catch rainwater whenever they could, but the majority of the time they had to drink their own urine and turtle blood. Despite their initial optimism that their boss had probably heard their mayday message and would be sending people out to get them, as days turned into weeks and weeks turned into months, they realized that probably no one was coming to find them. Now their only hope was a plane spotted them flying overhead, or perhaps they could drift into a shipping lane and a boat could spot them. But without any way of navigating their boat, they really were just leaving it up to luck. Despite their dire situation, Jose stayed really positive and he focused on catching food and catching water, and he tracked the time really diligently by tracking the phases of the moon. Ezequiel, however, just did not have a significant role on the boat because he just wasn't skilled enough, and so he found himself sitting in the boat most of the time doing a whole lot of nothing, and he fell into a deep depression. He was not accustomed to being out on the water the way Jose was. Jose had been raised on the water. He practically only ate seafood, and a lot of it he ate raw. So in a way, Jose was kind of at home, Ezequiel was not. And then by the 4th month, Ezequiel just could no longer stomach the food they were eating. He would just get sick every single time. And so he just kind of gave up and he stopped eating. And even though Jose urged him to eat and would get him food, he didn't eat it, and eventually he starved to death. Even though Ezekiel was not a huge asset in terms of helping them survive, he did provide Jose an enormous amount of comfort. It was like you had your partner in crime here, and then once he died, Jose was alone for the first time in nearly half a year, and he fell into a very dark depression. And for 6 days, he did not touch Ezekiel's body. He just sat there and stared at him and even contemplated taking his own life. But on the 7th day, he doesn't know what it was, but he had this sudden urge to want to survive. And so he gave Ezekiel a kind of makeshift funeral. He said a few words and then disposed of his body in the ocean. And then after that, Jose became laser focused on just surviving. And survive he would for another 9 months. All by himself, out in the middle of the ocean, just floating around, drinking turtle's blood and drinking his own pee. But after those 9 months, he would finally see the thing he had been dreaming about. Land. He had managed to drift all the way to the Marshall Islands. So he leapt out of his boat, he swam to shore, and there was a hut right on the beach. He knocked on the hut, and a couple came to the door, and they were totally shocked to see this guy. I mean, he didn't look too good, and they couldn't even believe his story. They couldn't believe that he had survived for so long in the water. But they quickly brought him inside, they gave him some food and drink, and they contacted authorities, and he was saved. His parents and young daughter, when they found out he was alive, they were overjoyed. They, along with everybody else, believed he had perished. They had sent out a search party for them, and they'd found pieces of their boat that had broken off in the storm, and so they assumed, they must have sank. Then, in a strange turn of events, shortly after he got home, people began accusing him of lying about what happened. People said he looked too good to have been out on the open ocean for 14 months. He should have been emaciated, and at the very least, he should have had scurvy. But doctors would say he ate so many turtles and seabirds that he was pretty well fed. And turtles and seabirds contain a high level of vitamin C that would have protected him from scurvy. Other skeptics said it would have been impossible for his skiff to float the 6,000 miles to the Marshall Islands where he ultimately found land. But then a study done at the University of Hawaii confirmed there was a current that would have pulled him from the coast of Mexico straight into the Marshall Islands. And then lastly, Ezekiel Cordoba's family accused Jose of killing Ezekiel and eating his body for sustenance. That's the only way he was able to survive. But Ezekiel roundly rejected that and took multiple lie detector tests that proved he did not do that. Today, Jose lives in a small town in El Salvador, completely surrounded by land, and he says he doesn't go anywhere near the water. In 1971, Julianne Kepka was a bright-eyed German teenager who had just graduated high school. On Christmas Eve of 1971, she and her mother were at the airport in Lima, Peru, waiting for a flight to Pucallpa to visit her father, who was a zoologist working in the Amazon. She and her mother and everybody else waiting for this flight were really annoyed because the flight was 7 hours late due to bad weather. Finally, it arrived, and Julianne, her mother, and everybody else who had been waiting boarded LANSA Flight 508. And immediately after takeoff, they started hitting some pretty bad turbulence because of the bad weather, but Julianne really liked flying, so she didn't mind. Her mother, on the other hand, was white-knuckling the armrests. But after 10 minutes or so, as they were getting nearer to cruising altitude, the turbulence was not getting any better. In fact, it was getting much worse, and Julianne was starting to get worried herself. And then when the plane started shaking so violently that all of the overhead bins opened up and luggage and wrapped presents and Christmas cake started pouring out, Julianne now began white-knuckling the armrest. As she's sitting there, she looks out the window and she sees all this lightning right outside their window, and it was clear they were literally flying through a lightning storm. And so Julianne and her mother are just looking at each other, unable to speak because they're so scared, and they're listening to the other passengers screaming and yelling, and everyone's starting to panic. And then the plane starts really shaking up and down like it's being lifted 50 feet and dropping 50 feet over and over. And then all of a sudden, there's this bright flash inside of the cabin, and then the lights go out, and then they look out the left side and they see smoke and flames coming out of the engine that sits on the wing, and then the plane felt like it was just falling from the sky before it dipped into an aggressive nosedive and just started bombing straight down toward the ground. It turned out that big flash in the cabin was lightning striking the engine. Julianne would say, despite this unbelievable chaos, the worst moment imaginable, Her mother grabbed her by the hand and said, "This is it. It's all over." And that was the last thing her mother ever said to her. After that, all Julianne can remember is the sound of other passengers screaming and crying and the awful grinding sounds that the engines were making. And as she's listening to these horrible sounds getting ready to die, all of a sudden the noise just stops and she's outside of the plane. She's still strapped into her seat, but now she's in free fall away from the plane. And she remembers thinking how unbelievably lonely she was. And then she looked down and she saw the canopy of the jungle fast approaching, and she knew she was about to die, and then she passed out. She remembers nothing of the actual impact, but she would later find out the plane broke up 2 miles up. So she was in free fall for 2 miles in that seat before hitting the ground. She woke up the next day looking upwards towards the jungle canopy, and the first thing she said out loud was, "I survived." And she's looking around and she yells for her mother, but there's no one around her. No one yells back. And that's when she realizes, I'm all alone and probably everybody, including my mother, is dead. She had somehow managed to not only survive, but only have a broken collarbone and some deep cuts in her leg. She could hear planes overhead that were most likely looking for the crash site and potentially survivors, but she couldn't see them because the canopy was so thick, so they couldn't see her. She was wearing a very short sleeveless mini dress and flip-flops, but in fact she had lost one of her flip-flops, but elected to keep the other one on because she had lost her glasses in the crash and she was incredibly nearsighted, and so she would use this one flip-flop to test the ground ahead of her before committing with her bare foot. Before the crash, she had spent a year and a half at her parents' research station out in the Amazon, and in that time she'd picked up very valuable survival skills for being in the rainforest. So the first thing she did was stand up and go looking for a stream, because her father had told her, wherever there's a stream, that stream will oftentimes lead to civilization. And so she began walking, and sure enough, she found a stream. And instead of just walking next to the stream, she got in it and began walking directly in the middle of the stream, because her parents had told her that you're less likely to get attacked by a predator if you're standing in the water versus standing on land. She only walked a little ways before she came across the crash site. There was no bodies, it was just debris, and all she could find that was useful was a small bag of candy. So she took the bag of candy and continued walking down the stream. And for several days she trudged along, and she would say during the day it was incredibly hot and miserable, and at night it was very cold, and since she only had this small dress on, it was particularly miserable. But she said the scariest part of the whole ordeal was at night when you're trying to sleep. It's totally pitch black and you're in the middle of the Amazon and there's predators all around you. She said it was horrifying. On the fourth day of being in the jungle, as she walked down the stream, she heard the sound of a landing king vulture, a sound that she recognized from her time spent at her parents' Amazon reserve. And the sound of this vulture was just around the corner, so she couldn't see it, but she knew these huge vultures only showed up if there's a ton of dead meat. And so she knew as soon as she rounded that corner, she was going to come face to face with the bodies from the crash, potentially even her mother. But she kept moving forward, she turned the corner, and sure enough, there were bodies. The vulture took off, and what she was left looking at was a bench with 3 passengers on it, still buckled in, and all 3 of their heads had been rammed underneath the earth. They had clearly landed head first. Immediately, she had an intense sense of panic because she had never seen a dead body before, and she thought one of them was her mother. But when she went over to examine this particular corpse, she saw her toenails were painted pink, and her mother never painted her toenails. And so she had this intense sense of relief that it wasn't her mother, but at the same time felt very ashamed of that thought. There was nothing on the 3 bodies or near them that could help her survive, and so she said her goodbyes and she continued walking down the stream. By the 10th day of this ordeal, she could barely stand straight because of her broken collarbone and the pain in her leg, and so she began drifting down the river in one of the deeper sections, and then she thought she was hallucinating when she saw this big boat docked up against the side of the river. But when she went up to it and touched it, it was real. She went up on shore, she looked inside, there was no one in the boat, but it looked like a boat that was used, and there was a path that led back into the jungle. And so she followed the path and it led to this hut, and no one was in there, but outside was a jug of gasoline. And she had this wound in her arm that was full of maggots. And she remembered her father using gasoline to get maggots out of a wound in their dog. And so she took the gasoline and dumped it in her arm, and she said it was excruciatingly painful, but she was able to pull out 30 maggots and felt very proud of that accomplishment. After that, she fell asleep inside of the hut and just hoped that whoever lived here eventually showed up. And sure enough, the next day she woke up and she heard 2 men talking outside that were walking towards her. And she said the sound of their voice was like the sound of an angel. And when the two men came up the path and saw her, they were obviously very shocked. And they initially thought she was like this water goddess from a local legend that involved a half mermaid, half woman that was light-skinned. And she would tell them in Spanish that she's not a water goddess, that in fact she's a girl, and she had just survived a plane crash and she really needed their help. It was getting late that day, so they couldn't bring her out of the jungle right away. So they helped treat her wounds, they gave her some food and water, and the next day they brought her back to civilization. The day after her rescue, she was reunited with her father, and apparently he was so overcome with emotion because he believed she was dead that for several hours he just couldn't speak. Julianne was the sole survivor of the 91 people who boarded Lanza Flight 508. Her mother actually survived the crash, but then died several days later because she couldn't move. This is something that haunts Julianne and her family because they think about how horrible those last few moments for her mother must have been. Julianne ultimately recovered from all of her physical injuries, but to this day deals with significant emotional trauma. So that's gonna do it, guys. In June of 1982, 38-year-old Cindy Hack divorced her husband, Roy. As soon as she moved into another home in Vancouver, Canada, she felt this wave of relief come over her. Their marriage had become abusive and toxic years ago, but her newfound happiness would be short-lived. Only 4 months after leaving her husband, Cindy's waking nightmare would begin. It all started with a late-night phone call on October 7th, 1982. When she answered, the voice on the other side was raspy and angry sounding. It addressed Cindy by name and quickly told her that they planned on hurting her. And before Cindy could do anything, the caller had hung up. Cindy was horrified and didn't know what to do, so she did nothing. And then over the next few days, she received more calls from this phantom caller, and each of them began with this person addressing her by name and then threatening violence. And Cindy began to convince herself that this had to be some terrible prank, and so she continued to do nothing about it. One night, Cindy couldn't help but feel like she was being watched, and she looked into her living room and she noticed one of her windows was still open. At night, she would draw all the curtains in her house. And so she walked over to the window and she pressed her face up against the glass to look outside, and she didn't see anybody out there. And so she drew the curtains, turned around, and began walking back towards the kitchen when her phone rang. She hesitated, but eventually picked the phone up, and on the other side of the call was the mystery caller, who in a mocking tone told her that curtains weren't going to protect her, that they knew when she was home. This incident pushed her over the edge, and she knew this could not be some bad prank. This was real. And so she contacted the police, who made a house visit, but there wasn't any sign of a break-in or any sign of a crime being committed. And so after walking her property and feeling confident that she was safe, they told her that, you should really consider getting an unlisted telephone number. That way this mystery person can't keep contacting you. And so Cindy thanked them and would go on to get an unlisted telephone number. But not only would the calls continue, they would become more frequent. And in fact, the harassment in general only began to escalate. 3 days later, on October 15th, Cindy and her good friend Agnes were coming back from dinner to Cindy's house. And when they got there, they noticed that one of the front windows had been broken. And so they carefully walked onto the porch and realized the front door was actually unlocked and slightly ajar. They considered immediately leaving the property and just calling police, but they sat there for a minute and didn't hear anything inside the house, and so they decided they would just poke their head in and investigate. And so when they went inside, all the lights were off and there was no sign of a disturbance. It was totally quiet. But when they went upstairs, they found feathers all over the hall. And they followed those feathers all the way to Cindy's room. And in her room, all of her pillows had been ripped apart. And a key to her front door was laying conspicuously on her bedside table. The women fled the house and called police. But when they showed up, there really wasn't much they could do, despite knowing about Cindy's threatening phone calls she was getting. There was just no clear sign of who broke into her house and cut up her pillows. And so they told her that the best thing she can do is change her locks, make sure everything in her house stays locked at all times when she's home, and if she notices anything out of the ordinary, to call back. Over the following few days, Cindy got more threatening phone calls and began waking up to threatening notes laying on her front porch that had been made from newspaper and magazine clippings. This led to the police launching a larger investigation into the matter. An officer named Pat McBride, who had been on the force for 8 years, began checking in on Cindy almost daily. And very quickly, Pat and Cindy developed a romantic relationship, and Pat actually moved into Cindy's house while he was investigating this case. As soon as Pat moved in, the harassment seemed to stop. But just a couple of weeks later, in early November, Pat woke up one morning at Cindy's house and discovered that her phone lines were dead. When he went outside to investigate, he discovered that the lines had actually been cut, and he found a pair of wire cutters laying on the ground. Over the following month, in addition to the threatening phone calls and notes left on her porch, Cindy began hearing somebody walking around outside her house at night. but she was always too terrified to go to the window and look outside to see who it was. She began finding raw meat sitting outside of her door in the morning, and she would find pictures of dead bodies tucked under her windshield wiper on her car. One day, she walked into her backyard and she discovered 3 dead cats hanging in her garden. Cindy, who was a bubbly, happy person before the harassment started, had become a totally anxious and paranoid mess. But despite her obvious distress, the local police were starting to doubt her claims that this stalker was even real. Every time she called them claiming stalker activity, they would go to her house and look around, but they could never find any evidence to suggest that anyone besides her, her friends, or her boyfriend had been there. And speaking of her boyfriend, police officer Pat McBride, he would tell his coworkers that he was never home when the stalker called, and he never heard anybody walking around outside of her house. He said the only reason he knew about these things is because Cindy told him after the fact. Upset that the police were not taking her seriously, Cindy broke up with Pat and decided she needed to move and start over in another town. Just days before Cindy was supposed to relocate, her friend Agnes stopped by. When she went to the front door and knocked and there was no answer, she walked around to the back and she found her friend crouched down behind the stairs as if she was hiding from something. She ran over to her and noticed she had this black nylon stocking wrapped tightly around her neck, but Cindy seemed to be totally unfazed by it and just kept looking out towards her shed. And so Agnes runs over to Cindy and says, "Cindy, what are you doing? What's on your neck?" And Cindy turned to look at her and her eyes were super wide and she was panicked, and she told Agnes that just minutes ago she had been walking out to her shed to get something when a man leapt out of the shadows and wrapped this nylon around her neck and began choking her and threatened that if she turned around to look at him, he would attack her family. So Cindy and this man struggled for a minute until Agnes's car approached, which spooked the man and he ran off. Agnes was shocked and she grabbed her friend and picked her up. She pulled the nylon off of her neck and the two of them ran inside and locked all the doors and windows. And then at that point, Cindy called the police. But when the police showed up, the only evidence of this attack was Cindy's first-hand account and this nylon stocking. But the police believed the nylon stocking was Cindy's and she had staged the whole event and she had tied it around her neck herself. A few days later, in January of 1983, Cindy moved into a new home in a town called Richmond, which is a suburb of Vancouver, Canada. And as soon as she got there, she painted her car a new color and she actually changed her last name to James. For months, she didn't see or hear from her stalker. But in October of that year, she found another dead cat on her property with a note next to it that just said, "You're next." Fearing for her life, she called the Richmond police, who set up a surveillance operation on her property. But for months, despite dozens of officers watching her house at practically all hours, they never ever saw any stalker activity. But as soon as the officers left for any amount of time, when there was a gap in surveillance, Cindy would call the police and report stalker activity. In time, this town's police department also began to suspect that Cindy was fabricating the stalker story, and they told her as much. Now, blatantly knowing the police were not taking her seriously, Cindy hired a local private detective named Ozzy Caban to look into her case. Immediately, he installed floodlights all around her property, and he gave her a two-way radio to place inside of her house that constantly broadcast back to Ozzy. That way, if she was in trouble, he would know about it even if she couldn't get to the radio to actually tell him. He also installed a panic button inside of her house that would send an alarm to him as well as to the police. In January of 1984, after only being on the case for a couple of weeks, Ozzy heard some strange sounds coming across the two-way radio. It sounded like there was some sort of struggle happening in Cindy's house. And so he tried radioing her to ask what was going on, but he didn't get a response. And so he flew over to her house, he knocked on the door, but there was no answer. And so he kicked the door down and found Cindy lying in the hallway motionless with a note on top of her hand that was held in place by a paring knife that had been stabbed through the note and then through her hand. The note said, "You're dead, lady." Cindy also had a black nylon stocking wrapped around her neck. And so initially, Ozzy believed Cindy was dead, but he managed to find a pulse. And so he brought her to the hospital, and when she regained consciousness, all she could recall was feeling someone inject her arm with a needle, and then after that, she had no memory of the attack. The police, believing Cindy had staged the attack, did not bother to take fingerprints at her home or on the knife or on the note. Ozzy, on the other hand, believed his client was telling the truth. He didn't believe Cindy was physically capable of injecting herself in the area where the needle had entered her body. The angle was nearly impossible to achieve on her own. Once she was released from the hospital, the police, despite believing she was lying, continued their surveillance operation of her property. But like always, nothing ever happened when any of the officers were on duty. The stalker activity only was reported after they had left. Life went on like this for over a year, and during that time, Cindy's mental health continued to decline rapidly. She lived in constant fear of this stalker, and she was deeply embarrassed that the police believed she was lying. On December 11th, 1985, Cindy was attacked again, but the details on this are incredibly scant. Someone found her lying in a ditch 6 miles away from her home. She was wearing a single work boot and a single glove. She was suffering from hypothermia, and she had cuts and bruises all over her body, and she had a black nylon stocking wrapped around her neck. She had no memory of the attack. The police told her that they believed this was yet another staged event, and so they did not do any significant follow-up. After a few days in the hospital, she was sent home, but she was terrified to be alone. So she reached out to her friend Agnes and asked if she and her husband Tom would stay with her for a couple of days, and they agreed. The first night they were there, Cindy woke up in the middle of the night and heard strange sounds coming from the basement. She woke up Agnes and Tom, and they heard the sounds too, and so they went down to the first floor, they opened up the door to the basement, and they looked downstairs, and very clearly there was a fire raging in her basement. And so Cindy immediately ran to the phone to call 911, but they discovered the phone lines had been cut. And so Tom ran outside to try to find a neighbor to call 911 for them. And when he went outside, he found a man just standing there in front of the house watching it. And Tom yelled to him, "Hey, you need to call 911. This house is on fire." And this man, without saying a word, just turned and ran down the street. And that man was never identified. Finally, Tom did get a neighbor to call 911. The fire department arrived and they put out the fire. And then after an investigation, they determined that the fire had been set intentionally. This was an act of arson. And the police said there was no signs of forced entry anywhere around the house, which means someone who was already in the house had to have started the fire. And they specifically said Cindy had to have started the fire because she stages these events all the time because of this stalker delusion she has. Agnes and Tom denied this claim, saying they never heard Cindy walking around at night and she would never jeopardize their lives. After this event, Cindy became extremely depressed and had to be hospitalized. And for 10 weeks, she was under intense psychiatric care. But at the end of those 10 weeks, the doctors determined that she was not a threat to herself or to anyone else, and so she was sent home. It was at this time that Cindy went to the police and said that she thinks Roy, her ex-husband, was behind all of the attacks. Police immediately brought Roy in for questioning, and he emphatically denied all allegations, saying he had nothing to do with it, and in fact, he had been the victim of this stalker that was going after his ex-wife. He said he got a number of these threatening phone calls, and one time when they called, they left him a voicemail, and he played it for the police. After speaking with Roy and confirming his various alibis, the police ruled him out as a suspect. For the next 3.5 years, Cindy continued to receive threatening phone calls and messages at her house, but no one besides Cindy ever saw this stuff happen live. While her private investigator, Ozzy, still believed every bit of her story, the Richmond Police Department had grown tired of her and stopped responding to her calls. On the evening of May 25th, 1989, Agnes showed up at Cindy's house for their scheduled game of bridge. When she knocked on the door, there was no answer. And because Agnes and Cindy were very close, Agnes tried the front door, it was unlocked, and so she let herself in, thinking Cindy must be upstairs taking a shower. But when she stepped inside, the house was totally silent. And after a couple of minutes of no commotion upstairs, Agnes began searching the house for her friend, and she discovered that Cindy wasn't there, and so she called the police. The police launched a search and very quickly found Cindy's car in a parking lot at a local supermarket. And when investigators went over the car, they discovered there was blood on the outside of the driver's side door. The contents of Cindy's purse, including her credit cards and ID, were scattered about on the ground near the car. And then in the trunk of the vehicle were the groceries that Cindy had recently purchased. But despite her car being found, there was really no indication of where she went next. Her friends and family believed she had been kidnapped by her stalker, and the police believed she was staging yet another event. But regardless, no one could find her. 2 weeks after her disappearance and 1.5 miles away from where her car had been found, a road worker had drank too much coffee and needed to use the bathroom. But where they were working, they did not have a portage on, and they were not near any local businesses that might offer public restrooms. The only area that offered any privacy was the abandoned building that was right near their work site. And so this worker told his crew where he was headed. He turned and began walking across the totally overgrown front yard of this property. And as he began walking walking around the side of this building, he smelled this horrific smell, like one of the worst smells he'd ever smelled in his life. And he assumed that because this property was abandoned, maybe people were dumping their trash on it somewhere and it's a hot day and that's why it smells. But either way, he wrote it off. He walked around to the back of this building. He found a good spot. He relieved himself. He turned around and began walking back along the side to go back to the road when he stopped, because he saw something lying near the side of the house that he was surprised he hadn't noticed on his way in. He couldn't really see what it was because the tall grass was obscuring his view, and so he took a couple steps forward to get a better look, and when he could see clearly what it was, he stopped. Because laying in front of him was a clearly deceased woman laying on her side with her hands and feet bound behind her back, and around her neck was a black nylon stocking. It was the body of Cindy James. Despite the nylon around her neck, the autopsy revealed she did not die from strangulation. She died from an overdose of morphine and other drugs. The police brought in a not expert who was easily able to put himself in the same position that Cindy was in and tie himself up. With this information, combined with their belief that Cindy was a pathological liar, they concluded that this had to have been self-inflicted, that she injected herself with the lethal dose and then dropped down to the ground and tied herself up to stage the epic conclusion to this stalker delusion. To cover their bases, the police did re-interview Roy, the ex-husband, but his alibi checked out and realistically, he was never actually a suspect. It's not listed online whether Pat McBride, the police officer ex-boyfriend, was ever investigated. While the police were very confident in their theory of what happened to Cindy, there were some discrepancies. The medical examiner did not agree with the ruling that this was a suicide. He said that you can't conclude that. There's not enough evidence. During the autopsy, it was discovered that Cindy did have an injection mark in her arm, but they could never find the needle anywhere near her body or anywhere between her and her parked car. Considering the extremely high dosage of narcotic that was found in Cindy's system, if this had been a suicide, as soon as she injected herself, she would have had to immediately shift gears, get down on the ground, and start hog-tying herself before she became too intoxicated to function, meaning the needle should have been right around where she was found. But it wasn't. Also missing from the crime scene were Cindy's shoes and socks. And interestingly, her bare feet were totally clean, despite the fact that in order to get where she was found, she would have had to cover a distance of at least 1.5 miles from her parked car. But again, there was no dirt or any markings on the underside of her feet. Also, it was strange that she wasn't discovered faster than 2 weeks. Although she was found near this abandoned house that was totally overgrown, the house was actually frequented by teenagers, and there was a walking trail nearby that would have had a line of sight on her body. These discrepancies have led many people to believe that Cindy did have a stalker, and this stalker kidnapped her in the supermarket parking lot. They tied her up, they injected her with the lethal dose of morphine, and then after she had died, they dumped her near this abandoned property right before she was found. And they had left that black nylon tied around her neck because that was the stalker's signature. Some have taken this a step further and said Pat McBride, the police officer, was behind the attacks, because he would have known when surveillance was set up on her house and could have very easily avoided detection. But the most bizarre and fascinating theory of what happened to Cindy is that she had dissociative identity disorder, or DID. This is where someone maintains at least 2 distinct personalities, and when one of those personalities is active, the other kind of fades and has no memory of this experience, creating these huge memory gaps. And so the theory goes, one of Cindy's personalities was effectively stalking herself. Or more specifically, one of her personalities hated herself and wanted to do herself harm. And so that personality would do things like stab her own hand or run 6 miles away into some ditch and leave herself for dead. And then Cindy's other personality would take back over and she would suddenly come to having no memory of how she became injured or how she wound up in this ditch. And so when she went to police to tell them that someone is stalking, is harassing, is attacking me, she was telling the truth. But that someone, that stalker, was actually her. She just didn't know it. But Roy, her ex-husband, was a psychiatrist, and in their 16 years of marriage, he never noticed this condition. And when Cindy was in that psychiatric ward for 10 weeks following one of her stalker attacks, none of the doctors or psychiatrists ever noticed or diagnosed her with this condition. It's still possible she had DID, and it just came on later in life, and it didn't present itself enough to be noticed during those 10 weeks of psychiatric care. But realistically, this reduces the chances of DID being behind this whole thing. To date, her death is still considered a suicide and no one has ever been charged in connection. On January 27, 1908, a 34-year-old handcuffed man walked out from behind the curtain to a cheering crowd inside of a theater in St. Louis, Missouri. This was going to be this man's first ever live performance, but he did not seem nervous. Next to this man on stage was this comically oversized milk can that was filled to the brim with water. Once the audience had stopped clapping and had calmed down and taken their seats, this man on stage turned to face this milk can and then climbed up this small ladder and then lowered himself feet first into this can, and as he did, his body displaced water from the can, causing it to spill over onto the stage. And then once almost all of his lower half was submerged in water and the audience could only see his face, this man looked over at his assistants in the wings of this theater and kind of gestured to them that he was ready to start. And so the assistants come running out into the middle of the stage and they immediately close the lid of this milk can over this guy, pushing his head down into the water. And so as the audience is gasping and collectively holding their breath, the assistants proceed to lock this lid with 6 different locks around the top. And then they wheeled over this cabinet that kind of collapsed around the can, so it was totally out of view of the audience. Now, for this audience, they had never seen anything like this before. And so immediately they all began murmuring and whispering to each other, wondering how this guy is going to survive what he's doing. But 2 minutes after that lid had been sealed, that 34-year-old man emerged from behind the cabinet with his hands open wide, so he wasn't handcuffed, totally unharmed. And then the cabinet was moved aside and the audience could see the lid of this milk can was still locked. During his lifetime, nobody could ever figure out how the great magician Harry Houdini had escaped that milk can. These dangerous stunts made Harry extremely famous, and it's why we still know him today, nearly 100 years after his death. But it wasn't just that he was able to successfully perform these stunts, it was his attitude while he performed these stunts that made him so notable. He really just came off as being totally fearless, that he was willing to do just about any stunt. But that wasn't actually true. There was one stunt that Harry was absolutely terrified of. Now, he would eventually work up the courage to attempt this particular stunt, but while he was doing it, he panicked and he had to be rescued by his assistants. And after that, he never tried it again. And for decades, nobody else tried it either. Because, I mean, if Harry Houdini can't perform this stunt, then certainly no one else can either. But in 1990, a daring 32-year-old man named Joe Burris decided he would be the person who would finally conquer this infamous stunt. Joe was a small-time children's magician in Fresno, California, but deep down, he had always believed that someday he would be the next Harry Houdini. In fact, he would actually tell his family that not only would he be the next Harry Houdini, but he would be even better than Harry Houdini. And so that year, he decided it was finally time to make that dream a reality. And so he saw performing this infamous stunt as a way to make that happen. So on Halloween night of that year, so October 31st, Joe, adorned in his white tuxedo, along with his 2 young sons and his parents, they arrive at Blackbeard's Family Fun Center, which was an amusement park in Fresno, California. The family hopped out of the white limousine that Joe had arranged to bring them there, and they began walking across the parking lot to this big crowd of people. And when this big crowd of people saw Joe walking towards them, they all began to cheer. Joe's stunt that he was about to perform that night had been very heavily advertised, mostly by Joe, and so it had become this spectacle in Fresno. It was going to be aired live on TV while he was doing it, and it was going to be broadcast on a radio station. So after Joe and his family make it over to this big crowd, Joe walks to the front and he climbs up on this impromptu stage and he gives this impassioned speech to his audience about how he's going to be the one who takes on this stunt and becomes the next Harry Houdini. And then afterwards, he looks over at his assistants, all these guys that are around him, and he gestures to them that he's ready to begin. And so with all these TV cameras rolling, the assistants walk up to Joe and they begin shackling his wrists and they put these chains around his body, and then they lifted him up and put him inside of the see-through plastic coffin. And then this coffin was lowered into the 7-foot pre-dug hole that was right nearby. Once Joe gave the signal that he was ready to go, they would fill this hole in, and the stunt that he would perform would be to escape being buried alive. Houdini had attempted this by being buried under 6 feet of dirt. And he had managed to get out of his coffin, but then he just could not get through the dirt and began to panic. And had it not been for his assistants literally reaching into the dirt and pulling him out, Houdini would have died. Joe, apparently, a year earlier, had attempted some sort of practice run of this stunt. It was not the full amount of dirt. It was some smaller amount of dirt, and he had managed to get out. And so he was really confident in himself. And so for this big televised event, he had decided to really up the ante and make sure it was clear he was not only as good as Houdini, but better than Houdini. And so he was going to have 3 feet of dirt put on his coffin first, and then 4 feet of wet cement put in on top of that. Many people, when they heard this plan, both the TV personalities, the radio personalities, onlookers, they said this was a terrible idea and you shouldn't do it. But Joe was extremely confident and brushed them off and said, "I know what I'm doing."
You know, Houdini failed at this and he was only using dirt.
Once Joe was in his coffin at the bottom of the 7-foot hole, he looked up at his assistants standing over the grave waiting for a signal, and he gave it to them and kind of shouted up to them that he was ready. And so his team very excitedly began shoveling dirt into the hole. But after only a couple of minutes, when less than a couple of feet had been put in the hole, they heard Joe yelling out from inside of the coffin. And so everything stopped, the staff jumped in, and they pulled the dirt out until they could finally get the lid of the coffin off. And they found Joe. He was alive, but he was very shaken up, and he kind of sat up and said, "Yeah, the chain around my neck is too tight. You got to readjust the chain." Now, all these onlookers at this event, they heard Joe say this, and they saw him, and their read on this situation was not that his neck chain was too tight, but rather, it looks like Joe might have bitten off more than he can chew. That this stunt is way more dangerous, and maybe he's realizing that, and he's looking for excuses to not do the stunt. And so the onlookers, they didn't try to egg him on to do it anyways. They started feeling apprehension too, and so everybody who was there began telling Joe, "Hey man, get out, don't do this now, this is a really bad idea, it's not worth it, the chain's too tight, that's a sign, don't do it, don't get back in." But Joe, after kind of collecting himself, told the group that he was totally fine, that it was really just the neck chain that was the only issue, and he demanded his staff put that chain back around his neck after they loosened it up, and then put him back in the coffin and fill it in. And so eventually his staff, taking cues from him, said, "Okay," and they got his neck chain readjusted, and they put him back in the coffin, they chained him back up again, they closed the lid, and once again he gave the signal that he was ready to start. And so a very apprehensive crowd watched as the dirt went back in, and after 3 feet of dirt were in the hole, the cement truck came over and poured 4 feet of wet cement on top of the dirt. And then after this hole had been completely filled in, the onlookers, which included Joe's 2 young sons and his parents, they kind of moved in and got right up against this grave and were looking straight down at the top, waiting for Joe to come out again. But as they're watching this hole and as they're filming this hole, all of the cement in the hole suddenly drops about a foot. What had happened was the nearly 15,000 pounds of dirt and wet cement sitting on top of this coffin had finally caused the lid to break, and in an instant, all of the dirt and cement poured into the coffin surrounding Joe completely. He was truly buried alive. Onlookers immediately jumped into action and did their best to try to dig Joe out, but it took them 30 minutes to finally reach him, and when they did, he was already dead. Joe had ironically died on the exact 64th anniversary of Houdini's death. After an investigation, it was determined that Joe had not tested the strength of his plastic coffin against the weight of the wet cement. He'd only tested it against dirt because that was the one he had done the year earlier. He had done it under dirt and it worked. Joe had also not taken into account that cement dries from the bottom up. So even if Joe had managed to get out of the coffin and make his way through the first 3 feet of dirt that was right on top of the coffin, he most likely would have been trapped under the hardened cement layer.
You realize that cement starts to harden first at the lower elevation, so it's going to be hard.
You mean it hardens at the lower part? I thought it started at the top.
No, it hardens at the lower.
No. In fact, I shouldn't even kid. This is very serious. This is no magic trick.
This was a doomed mission from the start, but because Joe was so confident in himself and his ability to do this stunt, no one stopped him.
He thought Houdini was one of the great escape artists, and he wanted to be better than Houdini. And he was close.
So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is. And where you found it, so give us the timestamp, and if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comment section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please ask the like button to play a very casual game of chess with you, and then proceed to beat them with the Fool's Mate. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 1 or 2 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like flannels and hats and sweatshirts and all sorts of stuff. If you're interested, go to shop